All right, I have got 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and I just want to say welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are really excited about today's webinar with Dan Russell. And I just want to remind you that here in a Zoom webinar, you can see and hear us, but we cannot see and hear you. So please feel free to use the chat feature. And if you have questions, there's also a Q&A button that you can use, and go ahead and type your question. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague here, our Technology and Extension Education Fellow with the E-Extension Foundation, Dr. Rose Hayden-Smith.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. And Aaron, thank you for the wonderful music, best waiting room experience ever. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Dan Russell. And he is Google's Senior Research Scientist for Search Quality and User Happiness. He's based in Mountain View. And he's sometimes called a search anthropologist. He earned a PhD in computer science, specializing in artificial intelligence. I had the privilege of reading his book, The Joy of Search, last year, and hands down, it was the best book I read last year, and it's helped me tremendously in my work. Prior to joining Google, Dan worked as a scientist at IBM, Xerox, Apple. He's got an amazing MOOC. We'll be dropping links throughout this wonderful presentation to various things that he offers and resources that he provides. And so with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dan because you're going to want to hear every minute of this presentation.
Great. Thank you, Rose. Appreciate that very kind introduction. What I'm going to do is just turn on my presentation, let that get going, and then I'll talk over that. And if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll try to get to them if I see them. Otherwise, we'll get to a bunch of questions, and I'll leave time at the end for people to chime in and ask questions. Okay. So let's get going here. So the way that I think starts is with the story here, and the story is basically when I started to write this book, as Rose said, The Joy of Search. Two things happen. First, my boss comes to me and says, Dan, you know this is Google. The moment you write this book, it's going to be out of date. When you hit enter for the final print, it's going to be antique. Why would you do that? And so I said, I know we work at Google, but a book is different. A book is a different kind of thing. It's more than just documentation. It's in fact a way of capturing cultural knowledge. It's a way of thinking about complex ideas. And in some sense, it's kind of a sacred object. It embodies a time, a place, and the fancy word I'll use is ontology. It's a way of thinking about the way you know things about the world. Because face it, I know what you do. You use Google all the time. You look up what's the population of Japan or whatever, right? And the way we use Google is now interlocated with the way we think. And so I wrote that. And so I wrote the book, and originally was entitled, true story, The Joy of Finding Out. And 2 weeks before we went to press at MIT Press, the editor called me up and said, hey, Dan, we're going to change the title. And I thought, really? 2 weeks before publication? She said, yeah, we're going to change it to The Joy of Search. And I said, that's going to remind people of other books, either the Joy of Sex or The Joy of Cooking. Right? And she said, we know. In fact, it's just two other things that people think they're good at, and they're not. So one of the things that it taught me is, having a memorable title is important. But it kind of gets at sort of, I think, what is the heart of this book, which is how can we know, how can we remember, and how can we understand? So let's get going. So I wrote this book. This is the cover. And what's fascinating to me about this is I did not design the cover. They did. It's fabulous. It all worked out. It's a non-technical book. And the idea is really that I have keyboard glitches. The idea of the book is really to communicate stories about how you can be a better searcher, how you can do that thing you do all the time, except be good at it, rather than just flailing away at it the way we tend to do. So background on me, Rose gave you the quick introduction, but the way I think about myself is that I am a, there we go, I'm a cyber tribal, techno, cognitive anthropologist. So what that means is that I think about how groups of people think about, understand, and use technology of search systems. We have this thing out there. How do people use it? Do you know? So that's what I do. I study that, but I'm also a software engineer and a research scientist. And so my goal in all of this work is to be better at it, is to help people, help everybody, including the engineers who build Google, to build a better Google. What can we do? Part of that is predicated on, well, what is it that people do now? How do they think about it? And so that's really my research, is to understand how people think about this immensely complicated beast we built. And so my research really involves doing lots and lots of field work. I've done more than 300 field studies in the past few years. I teach a lot of classes, everything from rocket scientists to research people at the Library of Congress, surveys. I have data from this MOOC that I'll talk about at the very end. I've got lots and lots of data because, hey, I work at Google. I have lots of data, right? But one of the primary sources of my data is watching and talking to people as they live the experience of searching. Now, that sounds incredibly boring unless you're a reference librarian, but I'm part reference librarian by nature. And I think it really speaks at sort of the way I think about search, which is as a curiosity enhancing device. It's something that allows me to ask questions about the world. And in my studies, I want to see, well, how do you ask questions? How do you use stuff? So let me tell you, how do people learn how to search? Here's how. They learn from friends. Like, really? Because we know nobody reads the documentation. Nobody. Well, there's one exception, but you know, people in Japan read the documentation. Otherwise, globally, people don't. So it's an interesting question. How do people learn how to search? Well, I will tell you, thank heavens, they also learn a little bit from classes. So this is what motivated me in doing my online teaching, which is what motivated me really today to come talk to you through the extension, because these classes are really great. And one of the things I've learned by teaching over the past 13, 14 years is that people learn from friends, they learn from classes, and they remember stories. That is, they don't remember the documentation. They remember the documentation in the context of a story. Here's a problem. Here's what Dan did to solve the problem. And here's how I can do the same thing. And so the book is really a compilation of stories, which start with this interesting question and get to an answer. So Google is really a lot of things for a lot of people. That's sort of the first thing you learn. And people think about Google in interesting ways. So one of the things you can do with Google is go to it and type in a question, like what is the answer to life, the universe, and everything? And if you're a fan of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know what the answer is. And of course, Google will tell you what the answer to life, the universe, and everything is. And it concords with what The Hitchhiker's Guide tells us, that's 42. And of course, if you've read that book, you know that the real question is, what's the question, right? So I say all this by way of trying to get at what people do when they search. Because if you look at, for example, the classical search literature, and there is one, about how do people do information retrieval and how they search and stuff. There's this wonderful model, which is sort of broadly accepted by Carol Kultow, which is people go through this cycle. They go through this identification of a task, they locate sources, they click on pages, and they keep, and so on and so on. They go around this process. Let me tell you a little secret. This is what undergraduate students do in laboratories. Have you watched real people doing real searches? Yeah, I do. This is what they do. They perseverate. They go round and round very, very rapidly. They don't go through this careful pre-screening analysis and all that. They actually, in many cases, we've measured that they react in under 500 milliseconds, under half a second. They've already decided. Nobody's got time to go around that elaborate cycle. So what can we do? Given that we live in a world, this is the way people act, how can we make this an interesting and better search experience? So one of the key things of my research is to develop what we call mental models. That is, how do you think about it? How do you think about any complex piece of equipment? How do you think about your car? You might think it's a warm, fuzzy object, but somewhere there's a mechanic who thinks of it as terms of fuel systems and electrical systems and computational systems and all this. So how do people think about what a search engine does? So is it complete keyword search, or is it full text indexing, or what is it? What is it? This is important because the mental model that you have determines the way you think it works. In essence, it's an answer to the question, how does it work? Let me ask you, how does it work? So one of the fascinating things you can do with Google is as you type in different kinds of queries, you will get very different kinds of answers depending on what you type. You might not have expected this animated three-dimensional graph to show up when you type in a query like sine x squared plus cosine y, but it does. In some sense, that's an Easter egg, but in a deeper sense, it's actually trying to satisfy your implied intent. That is, when you type in something like that, you're actually trying to do a little exploration about the geometry of that. How can we help? A lot of people think about Google like this. Now, I don't know about you, but this is the information technology I used when I was growing up. And so when I was learning how to do research at my forebears' knee, we would use a card catalog. Okay, raise your hand. How many of you have never used a card catalog? Oh yeah, I know. I've given talks at universities where I ask this question, what is this technology? How does it recognize? What does it use it for? And nobody in the audience knew what it was. You think I'm kidding? I'm not kidding. There's an entire few generations of students who have never seen one of these. This is a card catalog. It is an index of typically the contents, which in this case is sorted by author's last name. Okay, so what do we do? People's mental model of Google is often like this. That is, everything is available all the time, constantly. 24/7 news of every possible edition, every possible piece of content in the universe. And that's not quite right. So what is right? One of my pieces of research, one of my studies, is I ask people to draw me a picture of how it works. And this is one of the answers I get. This is a picture that some student drew for me about how they thought Google worked. This is a computer science student. So it's a pretty decent picture. It's got user in the upper left corner. It's got queries. It's got crawlers. It's got all this stuff. There's an index. Pretty fabulous. Pretty detailed kind of thing. Mind you, this is a computer science student. What does the rest of humanity think? What does a normal person think about Google? Well, a lot of people draw pictures kind of like this. I'm sorry, this is slightly out of focus, but you get the idea. It says here, it's several overlapping concentric circles, nonlinear Boolean targets. Great. What does that mean? I have no idea. I bet the student who drew this for me, and this is a university student at a university whose name you would recognize, they have no idea. Okay, the fascinating thing about this, I've asked roughly 1,000 students to do this kind of drawing for me. I have a stack of images, probably a yard high. And on that stack of images, 33% of them, 1/3, have the word magic on them. When you write magic on a functional diagram like this, it means I don't know what's going on. I have no clue. Give up. We can do better. We can do better. So what is it? What is it? What can we do to help people understand this? It's interesting because when you ask questions of Google, you think things like this, and we're trying to probe here what the mental model is. That is how you think of it. So what is Donald Trump's wife? How old is Donald Trump's wife, right? You know the answer, but this is what Google will tell you. Oh yeah, 3 wives. What did you expect, right? The deeper point here is that Google doesn't think about knowledge in the normal way that humans do, all right? So the normal social protocol is if I ask you a question, how old is this person? You designate normally a single person, right? But in fact, Google knows, oh, there are 3. I don't know which one you mean. I'm going to give you all of them. Point. Google thinks about knowledge differently than you do, than I do, than humans do. So we can ask these interesting questions like, you know, well, what is the mental model you should have of Google? You could ask something like this, what color is the sky? And you know it'll tell you the sky, right? That's fine, that's not hard. I believe that works. But what about a question like this? What color is the sky on Mars? Can Google do that? If so, how would it do it? Here's the answer. Yes, Google gives you the color of sky on Mars, it's yellow-brown. And you can click on that link to find out why it believes that. Here's my deep point. Google can do all kinds of things that you may or may not understand how it does it. But if you don't understand that it's capable of that, you'll never ask the question. That's an important point. Because the amount of stuff that's indexed by Google is astonishing. We've scanned over 20 million books.
Of astonished, greatly surprised or impressed.
Sorry, my Google Assistant woke up. I have to be careful what I say. We've scanned 20 million books. We have hundreds of hours of YouTube content being uploaded every minute. We have billions of images. We have, for example, more than 700,000 lolcat images, more than 82,000 anteater images. I don't know why. I'm just telling you that's there, right? We have billions of documents that we've crawled, scanned, and indexed. What does this mean? One of the things it means is often I'll go around and I'll ask people, well, what can you do with Google? What kinds of questions can you ask? And they'll say, oh, I can do anything. Well, let's pause for a second. Think about that. Not all of humankind's knowledge is actually represented on web documents or images or whatever. So there are still difficult questions that you could ask easily that Google doesn't know what to do with. For example, what was the population of Japan in 1490? Tricky. How much does the Empire State Building weigh, with or without water? Why is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea a classic? How much apartment housing should San Francisco, the city, have? So it leaves us with this really interesting question. For us, the users of Google, what can you ask? Well, what can you ask? I mean, that's an interesting and implicit framing question for you, the user, because every time you turn to Google or a search engine of any kind, you implicitly have built in your expectations of what's possible to do. Right? So what can you ask? Could you ask this? The literati among you will recognize that as Aramaic, Amharic, and it's a question about the Ethiopian flag. And if you type that into Google, assuming you can figure out how to type in Amharic, it will actually give you this beautiful answer. What else can you ask? What else can you ask? Clearly, we can answer questions in Hindi, in German, in Amharic, and et cetera, et cetera. What about this? This is a language. It's a bunch of symbols. Sorry, we don't have any representation for Mayan glyphs. I can search for this image, but I can't ask this as a text question because there's no Unicode representation. I don't know how to type that on my keyboard. This lovely keyboard, hundreds of keys on it. None of those that we see in this picture are down here on my keyboard. I can't ask that question. You see where I'm heading with this? The kinds of things you think about that Google can do determines the kinds of questions you will ask. So for example, I could ask this question: what is less than, equal, greater than symbol? And you don't need to understand what the programming, why this is an interesting programming question, but it suffices to say that this is the null safe operator in JavaScript. So for particular kinds of programmers, this is a really useful question. Deeper point. Did you know you could do that? Did you know you could ask these questions? We can also ask questions like Unicode, like what does the smiley face emoji look like? What does it mean? And so on. Now, In reality, people turn to Google for all kinds of questions, like this one. My son walks in, this on his arm. Do we need to go to the ER? How would we ask Google that question? What would you do? Now, one of the things we know is that there's the ability to search by images. So I could take potentially a picture of this and search for Google for that arm picture. But you have to be careful. There are lots and lots of things one could do. There are even applications that people build that, for example, takes a picture of a flower and gives you the identification of that flower. Or an app I found online is this one, mushroom identification app. Caution, use with care. The fascinating thing about this app, it has 5-star reviews. If you go look at the app online, it's all perfect 5-star reviews. Why? Because only the survivors give reviews of this app. So it's a huge biasing effect, and we call this survivor bias, and it is literally survivor bias. So you have to think about, well, what does the system do? What does any information technology system do? So one of the things we found in our research is that people's mental models in reality, in the wild, super variable. There are people who believe, oh, everything is on the web, or 90% of everything is crap, or whatever, right? But let's talk for a little bit about what kinds of things you can search for, because that's fundamental, right? You know you can search for text. Could you search for images? Well, let's ask. So like I said, I do a lot of studies. So a couple of years ago, I asked this question, taking this picture as my big starting point. Here's a picture of a nice house in downtown Palo Alto. And I said to a bunch of search engineers at Google, can you find me an aerial photo of this house taken before 1977? How hard can that be? It's Google. Can you figure it out? Now, these aren't just random people. These were the software engineers who built Google. You think they would know? Asked 250 of them. None of them, 0, could answer that question. I then turned to Mechanical Turk, which is a way of sort of doing gig work, and I asked 2,000 people if they could do it, and one person of 2,250 was able to do it. Why? What went wrong? What went wrong is people didn't think about these other ways of asking and answering the question. So for instance, if you search in Google Books, you'll find this book, Over Time, Palo Alto, 1947, 1980. There's a lovely picture in the middle of it on page 33 of that house, taken before 1977. You could, for example, search for a website, another answer, historicaerials.com, and you can find a nice picture of 1956. This is all great, but it's telling me something about the way people think. And the thing that just killed me about the Google search engineers is that there's a solution that they should have known. They should have known about Google Earth. Now, Google Earth is our product that allows you to look at all the different places around the planet. You just zoom in and fine. But what most people don't know, and I'm here to tell you this little story, because you'll remember this story. Here's a little story, because Google Earth also has the ability to pull down the time slider and look at archival aerial imagery. Did you know that? 250 Google search engineers didn't know this. So I wouldn't be surprised if you said no. There are a few of you probably do know this, but nevertheless, one of the things that's interesting here is you can pull the time slider back to the left, 1948, and that big red arrow points to that house, an aerial image taken before 1977. Huh. So it's interesting to think about, what could you search for? So you might recognize this. This is a photograph I took in the inside of Sainte-Chapelle, this beautiful chapel, downtown Paris. Lovely place to be. The question here might be, could I look behind me? Could I look at, I took the picture. How could I see around the inside of this chapel? Well, if you know Google's Street View, you might realize that in fact, there's this ability to turn around. So if anybody in Google Street View has gone inside that building and taken this imagery, you can pivot Did you know that? Key question. What you know determines what you can ask. So we can do the same thing here using the same idea for Street View, except use it here in the Great Australian, the Great Barrier Reef. So see where I'm heading with this? The more you know, the better you get. So in essence, I want to pose this to you this way. What do we as users of Google, as users of Bing, of any search engine, what do we need to know about finding? What do we need to know in order to be able to drive? We need to know what's possible. That's why I wrote the book. So I'm going to tell you 2 more stories here. I'm going to tell you a story about chapter 2 and chapter 17. Here's chapter 2. The way the book works, each chapter starts with what I think of as a curious question. A question that somebody posed to me usually, or something I thought of, and I thought, I'd like to know the answer to that. So here's a question. Somebody sent me this, a friend of mine sent me this photograph and said, hey, Dan, I know you can figure out where this is. The real question is, where is the photographer standing when he took the photograph? Oh, for extra points, what's the phone number of the room where the photographer is standing? I don't know about you. I thought, wow, this is crazy talk. I don't know how to deal. I don't know what to do with this. So I will tell you, I sat and looked at this for a little bit and thought, I bet I know how I can do this. One of the things you can do is one of the tricks about using Google is to work with what you've got, right? So here, if we zoom in just on the top of that one building, you see it's got that little logo. It says like ampersand and a TP. So let's search for TP office building. And no, you don't get toilet paper office buildings. What you get is the TP office building in Warsaw. See the photograph in the lower left corner? Ah, it's in Warsaw, great. And so once we do that, we can figure this all out and very quickly figure out it's 1416 Zwarta Street, downtown Warsaw. That wasn't the question. The question was, where's the photographer? So once we know that, we can go forward and using another Google Earth feature, which is called Google Earth 3D Buildings. So you might not know this, but in Google, you can turn on Google 3D Buildings and actually see a representation of the buildings in that place. So in this case, what you see on the left is the original photograph. What you see on the right is the models that are built in order to be able to show you what you would see if you're at that location, okay? So it's an interesting question because what you end up doing is flying to that point in Google Earth. It's like a great flight sim. You fly to that point, and as you can see, the 2 pictures are lined up. Now what? The question was, where's the photographer standing? So they never teach this to you in library school. They don't teach it to you in computer science either. But the answer is, well, turn around, dummy, and look behind you, right? And once you do that, you can figure out that what's going on here is you're actually at this street address, Emily Plotter 53, downtown Warsaw, which is the street across, right? Great. Now, where's the photographer standing? Well, one thing is, if you look carefully at the image, you can see that there's this kind of blurry thing here. Now, I know how to take an image like that, and if it looks like a reflection, I can de-reflect it. I can reflect it back around the vertical axis, like that. Ah, that's a reflection of the Google logo. So it was one of my friends from Google who was in the Google Warsaw office and took the photo. Got it? Now I know how to do the search. Search for Google Warsaw offices, which is the stuff in the square brackets there. That's what I typed in. And you get the street address, and there is the phone number and the fax number should you need it. Now, I see there's a bunch of questions that have been coming in. I'll answer them at the end here. Like, I'm on a roll, and I want to keep going through my stories here. So what just happened? Well, what just happened was that, not all search sessions are instantaneous. Too often our students are sort of, they turn to Google, they ask a question, if they don't get the answer, they're done. Whatever, it doesn't exist. You can't believe the number of times I've had people tell me, Oh, this piece of information I want doesn't exist. Let's unpack that, right? So you can find the answers, but in some cases you have to link resources together. Go from the photo to the street address to Google Earth to Google Earth 3D buildings, back to the reflection tool, and so on and so on. You have to link these things together. So the story also teaches us that you have to transform this data sometime. You have to know what's possible. This goes back to the what's possible question. So let's think about this a little bit more. What's possible to find? I just showed you what looks like an impossible trick, right? How to go from a photograph to the phone number. What capabilities do you need in order to answer more complex questions? And how do we learn this? How do we help our students understand this thing? For instance, one of the things you can do here is in Google is you can search for events. You may not know this, but I'll tell you. You can actually say something like this: jazz concerts near me. I did this when I was in LA back in February, before the current plague, back when there were jazz concerts in Los Angeles. But you could say, show me jazz concerts in LA near me or this weekend, and it will tell you, because Google knows how to read these texts in newspapers and so on, and actually come up with descriptions of events. So this is pretty amazing to be able to do this. What else can we do? Well, what else we could do is ask for interesting things about medicine. So for example, OPCD. And if you notice on the right-hand side, that's called a knowledge panel. In this case, it's a very nicely detailed knowledge panel of information we've accumulated that we think is high quality, high credibility, and we've kind of gathered it together, trying to anticipate your next query. So what is it? What are treatments for it? How do you test for it? We basically packaged all that we know are the next most probable questions that people ask. That's what you see on the right. Now, more recently, of course, in the age of COVID, when you do a query like coronavirus, you'll see all that stuff on the left-hand side in red. Here's a big tip. If you see a bunch of stuff in red on a Google search results page, pay attention. We're trying to tell you something. And so a lot of the coronavirus or the COVID-19 queries have things like this, where they're highlighting pieces of information that we view as highly credible, well-resourced, and so on. Now, we also have other resources you may not know about, like patents. Google Patents, which you could discover by Googling Google Patents, just saying. But when you search for a patent, say a patent number like this, you get this beautiful presentation of what the patent is and all that. What I find really interesting here is if you look in the middle of the right-hand side there, you see where it says find prior art, right here? Find prior art actually spins up a very smart AI system that looks for analogous or referential prior art. This is the kind of thing that, you know, patent lawyers have to do all the time. But we now have automated this in a way such that if you have, this is the original patent. If you then ask for prior art, it will show you all the other prior art that is relevant to this patent. This is with very clever natural language processing. So one of the things here to know about is that, look, not only do we have lots of information, but what you can ask changes over time. Sometimes that change is dramatic. The patent stuff is just phenomenal. So that wasn't available 2 years ago. Wasn't available a year ago. It's brand new. Key point, pay attention. You have to pay attention to what's possible. Otherwise, you'll miss out on what kinds of questions you could ask and what you can do. So the question for us now is, how do you learn these skills? This is where the book comes in, okay? So chapter 17, my second story. Was Perry ever on Delos? And Delos is this island. Here's a picture of the island. It's in the middle of the Aegean Sea. So I'm smack dab in the middle, off of Greece. And we were there just a couple summers ago. This is the view from the boat as you approach the island. And this whole island, you go on the tour, you walk around, you see Greek this, Roman that, fabulous. It's really great. it's an island of temples and monuments and amphitheaters, all this. And at the very end of the tour, the very last thing you see is this. And this is the pediment, that is the bottom, of the temple of Apollo and Diana. Cool. Why is this the very end? Because that whole island was where the god Apollo was born. Great. So in some sense, this is the epitome. This is the key thing of the whole island. This is the reason the island was so heavily lived on. So the tour guide shows us this rock, and it's interesting. Lots of people have graffitied on it over the years. This was the slab on the very bottom of the monument of the temple. But I noticed this thing in the middle. See that? See that? It says in yellow, Captain M.C. Perry, USN, now 1826. Can you read that down there? That's cool. But importantly, I thought, is it Dad M.C. Perry? You know, the one we studied in high school in history? So I asked the tour guide, and she said, I don't know who M.C. Perry is. So I thought, well, I'll check. Is it that M.C. Perry? U.S. Navy, 1852. He opened Japan to the west by sailing a fleet of U.S. Navy vessels into the Tokyo harbor. Same guy. Was he also in the Mediterranean? Wow. So you do the obvious searches. U.S. Matthew Perry in Greece in 1826. And then you get a bunch of stuff. Turns out, I will spare you the time. You can go read about it in the book. It's basically, this is not great. It's useful results, but it's difficult to actually answer that question. And I ended up turning into the archives because I know that archives somewhere probably has a copy of the logbook. So I look for logbook USS North Carolina, which is what the query you see here in Google Books. The logbook is not in Google Books, but this thing is the Guide to Non-Federal Archives and Manuscripts. Now, what's that? That's what archivists call a finding aid. Finding aid is a book that says where the book you're really looking for really lives. And once you do that, you will discover that the logbook, which looks like this, right, is actually not at Stanford, it's not in California, it's actually held at the Eleutherian Library and Archives in Wilmington, Delaware. Great. In some sense, it helps because I know where it is, but it's a pain because it's the wrong side of the country. Well, okay, fine. Next time I'm in New York City, I take the train out of Wilmington and I go to the Eleutherian Archives, and they very nicely give me an archive card. And I go and they hand me the book. And I look at it, and it doesn't tell me what I need to know. Fine. So I know there's another copy of the logbook held at the Library of Congress. So I go to the Library of Congress next time I'm in DC, go to the Library of Congress, I requisition the logbook, and they bring out the logbook, and it's an exact copy of the one I saw in Wilmington, Delaware. Huh. And so I'm sitting at that desk. You see the desk there with nobody at it? That's my desk. I was sitting there working away. And I was sitting there sort of with my head in my hands, looking very dejected. And the archivist of the United States comes by and says, you know you're looking at the logbook. This is what the logbook looks like. And you see down there near the bottom where it says 789 on the left, lower left, it says running along the south side of Delos. So I know they're there on the right day, but that's all I know. Did they actually do anything? And the archivist says to me, Dan, you know, what you really want is not the logbook, because that's just where they were. What you want are the letters. What do you mean? What do you mean, letters? Yeah. Turns out that all the ships of the line at that time, people would write letters to their wives or girlfriends or whatever, and they would then make a copy and put that in the letter file that goes with each ship. Fine. So I requisition the letters, I wait an hour, they come to me, and they look like this. And so I basically am learning how to read 19th century handwriting, which is a trick, I tell you. But I learned how to do that. And this letter, I'll translate it for you. It looks like this. This is a letter that was written home on that same day that I know that they were there. And it says here, the stuff in red, I have at this time on board the NC in the North Carolina as many relics of one kind or another as would load 10 wagons, and among them number 2 white marble altars from the temples of Apollo and Diana at Delos. Haha, this gun is smoking, right? I've got the letter where they said, not only were we there, but we stole a bunch of stuff. They committed archaeological vandalism, including the altar that was sitting on top of the pediment that Matthew Perry graffitied, 1826. This is a pretty amazing thing, but let's back up. The point of the book here now is to try to teach you lessons about doing this kind of research. So a bunch of lessons on, when to use double quote, when to use finding aids, and so on. But also a big point here is the power of a social network. In this case, the archivist who walks by my desk and says, Dan, you need to look at the letters. When an archivist tells you something, listen, they know more than you do. So, lesson, not everything is on the web. Sometimes you actually have to go to the archive and find out. And sometimes you have to do careful reading. So that was chapter 17, but I'll tell you another couple of things before we wind up here. One of the things that has struck me as I watch people working, as I was watching this young woman working, was their ability to find stuff on the web varies enormously. So in particular, one of the things that struck me about watching her was she didn't seem to know how to find text on the page. Now you, I assume, know how to find text on a page. You use Control-F or Command-F. And if you don't know this, pay attention, you really need to know this. You really need to know this. So it allows you, if you're on a Macintosh, to type Command-F, and then allows you to type a string, and you can find that string on the page. Great. If you're on the other kind of computer, you type Control-F, the same thing, same idea. So because I'm a research scientist, I do studies. And so I asked a bunch of people to come in over time, and I said, hey, here's a web page, which is these are the results from a 5K run in Palo Alto near me. And I said, all I want you to do, only thing I want you to do is find out how long it took Beth Smith to run this race, right? Now you, as a literate person that is illiterate in digital things, would know you type Command-F or Control-F, type in Beth Smith, and find the answer, right? Done. How long would it take you? 4 or 5 seconds, maybe 10 seconds max? Great. Well, here's what happens. See this graph? The x-axis is the amount of time it took in 10-second buckets, how long it took people to answer this question. And as you see over here on the left-hand side, there's that big peak. You're probably over there. You're in the 10-second group. It takes you 10 seconds. But if you look on the far right-hand side, there are people who took more than 5 minutes to find the answer to this question. The thing that struck me, though, was that people who took more than 2 minutes, that is 120 seconds, a quarter of their answers are wrong. How can that be? I will tell you. People who don't know Control-F don't know Control-C, Control-V. That is, they could not copy the text using a keyboard command, and they would retype it into my form and swap numbers or misremember something. That's a striking thing. Control-F is a really, really enormously performance-enhancing thing to know. So I did a survey. How many people know this? Turns out 90% of the internet using population in the US does not know this, does not know this. 9 out of 10 people. So I'm willing to predict some of you listening don't know how to use this, in which case this is probably the most important thing you can get out of this whole talk today. So I did this multiple kinds of surveys. It doesn't matter, nobody knows it. So what else do people not know? Do people know about spoof sites? Do they understand the conventions of the genre and the cultures that we're working on? So here's an example. Maybe you've seen this website, Pacific Northwest Tree Octopus. It's a spoof. This animal does not exist. And yet every year there are 6th graders around the United States who write these articles based on this website. It's a joke. It's a joke. It is, it's the spoof site. Here's another one. CNN is not a spoof site, but maybe you've seen this video. Now, I have to tell you, Pope Francis is a marvelous man, but he did not do that, right? This is a faked video. How would you know? What else do you not know? Well, let me tell you, content changes rapidly. There's an example of fake video. Fake video is increasingly going to be an issue. And we have to understand what the video world is like. Because the video world on YouTube, there are 400 hours of content uploaded every minute. Every minute. 3 billion videos are watched every day, and 1/3 of those videos are for educational purposes. 1/3 of the billion views are to learn something. So we've got this enormous thing. So let me give you an example. Because video changes, the kinds of questions you can ask change all the time. So here's an interesting example. My son comes to me a couple of years ago and says, "Hey, Dad, you know that song they sing at Stanford basketball games? No, here's what it looks like at a basketball game, and the music sounds like this." Right? Yes, you have. You probably sung it before. So he says, "I want to get that on my phone. What do I do?" You work at Google. We can figure this out. Well, Shazam won't work, and the other apps won't work, including Google's apps won't work, because those rely on digitally recorded, copyrighted songs. This was 1,000 drunken Stanford fans chanting that song, and it doesn't work. So what do? I think I know what we'll do. We'll do lyric search. Lyric search. I say, "Son, what are the lyrics?" He goes, "It's oh, 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 oh." And I think for a second, I work at Google, I work in search. That's a terrible query. And I said, "Son, give up."
Here's what I found.
At the time, my son was 16, and so he, being a good 16-year-old, turns to Google and types in oh, 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 oh. And you see that first hit there? He's got that song on his phone now. What went wrong? Why did I not understand this? What I didn't understand is that question answering sites where somebody asks, "What's that song that goes, oh, 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 oh?" One person has to answer it, and Google indexes that. So I missed the rise of an entirely new way of answering questions. So here's the thing. The way we ask questions, the technologies we use, the underlying models that the system uses change constantly. And so understanding how to ask questions is deeply, deeply important. It is a critical learning skill. Wind up with last story here. So here's a site that somebody sent to me, epafacts.com. They said, "Hey, Dan, what's the story with this site? Seems weird that the EPA would be doing this, but what's the story?" And I said, "I took a look at it." And the thing that struck me about it is this is an odd thing for the EPA to do, right? Now, let me tell you, the person who sent this to me is pretty young 20s. They were asking this question like, "Dan, how do we validate something like this? How do we know that it's accurate?" And so we took a look at it, and the thing you should realize here is this is in the about description of the website, EPA Facts, the Project Environmental Policy Alliance. Two things should be ringing your spider sense at this point. One, why is it not .gov? Two, I thought the Environmental Protection Agency was the name, not the Environmental Policy Alliance. So if you go look up EPA, just EPA on Google, you'll find out that this is the logo of EPA.gov. Wait, notice anything funky about these two logos? One is trying to consciously spoof the other. Huh. So what happens now? If you look up the Environmental Policy Alliance, their street address is 1090 Vermont Avenue, DC. Hey, if you've never been to DC, that sounds reasonable. It's odd that it's in Suite 800. So let's look for that. Let's look for the street address and Suite 800. And what do you find? You also find this company called Berman and Company, same street address, same suite number. Oh, alarm bells should be ringing for you at this point, because I doubt that the EPA fits inside the suite with Berman and Company. So if you look up Berman and Company, you quickly discover that they're a lobbying firm in DC. They lobby for big ag, big oil, and big pharma. Got it. So here's the real Environmental Protection Agency, and they've got a more reasonable street address. And if you look up that street address, you get a lot of EPA.gov sites. All makes sense. You can find these things. Now, the reason I bring this up, as I said earlier, it's a critical learning skill. So here's the killer statistic from my colleague Sam Weinberg at Stanford. So we've been talking about this a lot for the past few years. 80% of university students cannot figure out what I just walked you through. They can't do it. They go to the EPAFacts.com site and say, ah, the EPA, it's not what I thought. It's very weird. That should flabbergast you. That should just floor you. 80% of our university graduates can't do that little piece of analysis. So what does this mean? What it means, I think, for me as a Google guy, is that we need to design these systems, these information systems, to support this kind of level of information literacy and constant learning. And we all need to be students about this. It's not enough to learn how to do this once 10 years ago. Believe me, we've shipped thousands of changes to Google in the past 10 years. So has Bing, so has Wolfram Alpha, so has Yandex, so has Baidu. All of these different search engines continue to evolve. The scope and breadth of things that they can search and index is just vastly different than it was even 2 years ago. You need to know this. So I started this whole talk by saying, you know, this is the kind of stuff I want to teach. I want to help people understand this. And so I produced a course called, an online course called Power Searching with Google.com. It's 33 lessons, each about 5 minutes long. And so you can actually work your way all the way through it. And it will teach you some of these skills I just outlined. And that's online now. You can just go and use it. And of course, I got this book, right? Which I hope you find interesting, which basically tells these 17 stories, how to be a better searcher, how to search for something in ways that you might not have thought about. Not a technical book, but it emphasizes this point. You can and must know how to search deeply and effectively. This kind of skill is not optional. If you're going to be a real participant in the modern economy, in the modern technological world, this is sort of key to everything you need to know. It's the way that we get things done. In essence, what this is an attempt to try to augment the intelligence of ordinary people. For your spouses, your siblings, everybody you know. We want to help people be curious about their world and give them the skills, the knowledge, and mental models they need in order to be able to answer the questions they ask. We live in this complicated information landscape that's constantly evolving. What can we do? How can you help me? How can I help you to make people be better consumers, better users, better searchers for information? So that's my book. This is a bunch of information I've got here. That's my blog. You can go up there. If you're interested, I publish every week. I publish a post about this. And you can figure out how to do that. As a researcher, I leave you with an interesting question. Find my blog posts, my site, and you will figure out very quickly where my homepage is, bit.ly, Dan Home. There I tweet a couple times a week. My email, if you want to contact me. I have a game online called the googleaday.com. And if you want to find out more about the book, there it is, thejoyofsearch.net for everything else. I hope this was useful, and I think it's now time. I hear vast peals of applause, so I'm going to switch over to the questions now at this point. That's all right. Is that okay with you, Rose?
That is wonderful. What a wonderful presentation. I'm going to let you work through the Q&A.
Wow.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah, it turns out I can't read the questions while I'm talking. That's a little difficult. Do you think I should start at the top or the bottom?
I think maybe you should start at the bottom and work back up. Would it be helpful for you to have me read the questions?
No, I have them here. I'm gonna reshare my screen with you so everybody can see what the questions are here. So you should be able to see my screen, which has the questions on it, right? Do you see
Yeah,
that?
they're not going to be able to see the questions from what you're sharing, but they can pull up the Q&A, and they'll be able to see questions
Okay.
that you'll be answering live.
Okay, I'm going to go to the open questions. I'll start at the very top, and we'll just kind of power through them. So Neil asks, how many results does Google supply to each query? Is there a mathematical strategic place to stop? That's a really interesting question, because it depends on the query, but some queries, as you know, have millions and millions of results. We sort order those millions of results so that only the best one is number one, second best is number two, and so on, so on, so on, right? So truthfully, I rarely go to page 2. If I'm going to page 2, and I put it this way, I never go to page 3. Right? Yes, I know there are another 1,000 pages down there. I don't care, because the ranking algorithm is pretty good. We spend a lot of time on this. If you want to get a slightly different take on the query, on the question you're asking, change the query. Right? Don't bother looking at page 4 or 5, because the quality drops off very, very quickly. Okay, Anonymous asks, how do you ask a question that has several different descriptors of the same thing, and many descriptors have more than one word? For example, what is a plant with red thorny canes, no flowers, small green leaves? I don't want red to describe the flowers. I want red to describe the canes. So plants are hard. Plants are really hard, just in general. There's another question elsewhere about the quality of plant photo ID systems, and they're getting better and better. So that's one answer, is use a plant identification app. Second thing, but your question remains. When you're having these complex descriptors like that, what I would do is I would group terms that go together in phrases. So for example, red canes, and I put double quotes around it, double quote, red canes, double quote. That way that stays together as a descriptor. See what I mean? You also should add in a location, because if you ask, for example, for blue wildflower, the blue wildflowers of California have nothing whatsoever to do with blue wildflowers in, say, India. Okay, so it's a blue wildflower, 6 petals, you know, whatever, coastal range, California, that kind of thing. That will help. That will help narrow that down. Dana, maybe that's the. Dana asks the. Whoops, everything just. Dana asks the question. Maybe that's the key, one of the key skills. How do you teach how to search for, how to ask for and link relevant pieces of information to reach the answer to your query? Read the book. I don't mean to be snarky about it, but it actually is, it's one of those things where it's like learning a language. You have to learn what goes together with what. And part of the trick here that I think a lot of students don't know is that in some deep sense, it's not about the questions you're asking, it's about what someone else writes about that topic. So in essence, what you're trying to do is to match or emulate the language that they use. So what you want to do is to try to use phrases and use terms that people who are writing about that topic would use. That forms the basis for the best query. Okay. Another anonymous question. How do you properly use and or not both, blah, blah, blah. So a couple things. The book has a little description about how to use these terms, these Boolean terms. The short answer is don't. We went to a lot of trouble to get all that Boolean stuff out of there. So first off, if you include the term and in your query, you are searching for the term A and D. We don't use that as an operator, as a Boolean action in the query. Same thing for not. Okay, if you want to exclude a term, use the minus sign. Again, I refer you to the book. Or you can look it up on my webpage. I have a complete list of all these things on my webpage. So both is not a thing. Both is a word that you would search for. So if you want to try red and not blue, you would say red space minus blue. And that way, so better example would be salsa minus cilantro. If you hate cilantro, that's what you want to search for. Salsa recipe minus cilantro, where you use the minus symbol, the hyphen, to negate it, to remove it from the results. Okay, Julie asks, I've struggled with how to help my students understand what kind of source they have found in answer to their search. I asked myself how I learned this, and I traced it back to journalism class. Any advice on how to teach this skill? Yeah, they're actually how to understand the kind of source. So a little bit like what I was saying in my talk is people have to understand and explore these different kinds of sources because, for example, is TikTok a source? Not in a journalistic sense, it's a media kind. But people are using TikTok videos as ways of expressing their journalistic intent. So one thing is that you have to stay on top of these genre shifts. You just have to understand. But your question about, what makes a credible source, on my website, I just published like 3 or 4 very short videos. Is this a credible source? Is this a credible medical site? So on and so on. Basically, it's just like what you knew I was going to say, which is it involves looking at what they cite, how they build their arguments, and what other people are saying about them. So credibility is an earned property. It's not something you just tack on to the side at the last minute. So it's a little bit like the old ways. You have to see what they're writing, what kinds of things they support and agree upon, and try to understand what they cite and so on. Okay. Wow. The longer I answer questions, the more questions get added. This is great. Let's see here. Can he please show how to use Control F? Oh, so quick question for you, Rose. I'm happy to do this, and I can keep answering questions. How long do you want me to answer questions?
I think that's an Aaron question about how much time we have and how much time you have. It was being so generous.
No, I'm happy to sit here and continue answering questions. So that's not a problem at all.
Dan, if you'd like to answer a few more questions, that'd be great. I know we are right at the top of the hour here, so yeah, if you'd like to do a few more, that'd be fine.
I'll do a couple more. I'm going to kind of zip through them and answer ones I think are really relevant here. And I'm going to try sharing my screen again, and just so I can show people how to do this. Share screen, desktop 1, share. There we go. Okay, now can everybody see my screen with the Google logo on it?
Yes.
Good, thank you. So the question here was how to use Control F. So I'm going to go. I'm just going to do a search for Catalina, the island, because So there's a nice Wikipedia article, nice and long. And oh, it's actually not as long as I thought. Let's go and find Santa Catalina places. So this actually just while I'm here, this is called a disambiguation page on Wikipedia. And so when I did a search for Catalina, it doesn't know which Catalina there are. Google makes its best guess, but in this case, I'm actually looking for the island, Southern California. So let's click on that. Now we have the article I was looking for. So now, suppose that what I want to do is search for scuba diving here, right? What I did, go back to the top here. I'm going to press Command and then click on F. Okay, so Command F, and what happens is you watch in the upper right corner, click. You see that little window pop up? See that? Okay, I'll make it go away. I'm going to do it again. I'm holding down Command and pressing F. Boom, the little text window appears. Now I'm going to type in my query here, scuba, and you can see it says 1 of 1 here. That means there's only one instance of the word scuba in this entire document. Okay, if you don't know this, practice it, because we've found that it improves people's search speed by 12%, which is massive. It's just massive. So it's probably the single most important thing I can tell you. The other thing that's important about Control F or Command F is if I do Command F, pop up the window again, and suppose I'm looking for, say, temple, the word. See that? 0 out of 0 results. I just proved that this word does not appear in this document, right? How often do you get to prove the negative of something? Very rarely, very rarely. So that's pretty cool. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, I don't understand how these things work. So I'll just zip through these real quick. One question from Anonymous is, does the order of words matter? Yes, is the short answer. If you're, for example, doing polo shirt size, I would put them in that order because, for example, names, Abraham Lincoln is different than Lincoln Abraham. More importantly, I'll show this to you in the display down here. Suppose I look for dog chow. I'm gonna search for dog chow, like this. And I get dog food, right? Now let me switch the order and I'm search for chow dog. What do you think I'm gonna get? It should be different, right? There you go. Very different. So nice example. Yes, the order of words matter because the order of words is sort of stereotypical. And so you want to follow that. Okay. Things change over time. How do you stay with the updates? Quick update. The easy way is just follow my blog. There are a bunch of blogs out there. Mine is one where I specifically talk about new features that come up in search and so on. So that's an easy thing to do. How do you, another question here from Russell, how do you limit Google search to not give information? That's not relevant to the question. Well, the minus sign is one way to do that. Minus cilantro, for example. Gregory asks, what do you see as the key link of this presentation? And with the extension. Could you say something about how extension thinking is connected with the joy of search and augmenting thinking? Extension is many things, and lots of people have lots of different sort of things. What this is, in a nutshell, this talk has been about how to be a better searcher, how to understand these deeper critical thinking skills. And I've only, this is only 50 minutes long, right? I only touched sort of the top, 5% of this. So my course goes into a lot more detail about a lot of this. The book goes into more detail about a lot of this. My blog goes into infinite detail about this. So it's basically how to help people be better critical thinkers, how to be better searchers for information. And to the extent that people in extension are trying to do things with knowledge, things with information, if you can be better at that, you're going to be better at doing all of your extension activities. What are some tools for, Cheryl asks, whoops, no. Kanaya asks, what are some tools for teaching web search literacy to undereducated adults? It depends on how undereducated they are, because a big part of the problem about teaching undereducated adults is that they don't know what they don't know. And a lot of assessing the quality of information relies on context information. Example, is nationalgeographic.com a reputable source or not? To you and I, that's sort of obvious, but that's because we know what National Geographic is. If you've never heard of it, it sounds like a wacky place. National Geographic, what? I mean, just listen to it, it sounds like a kind of bizarre concept. So what I would do, I don't know anything specifically. I think my course is pretty decent, but I think it's the kind of thing I've seen people use power searching with google.com in venues like this with a lot of support and hand-holding that seems to work pretty well. I see Aaron's back, so I think we're getting near the end of our time.
Yes, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, Rose. I just saw a question in the chat here if this is going to be archived for viewing later. That's correct. It will be in our Connect extension platform, and that's connect.extension.org. That's available to all cooperative extension professionals, so feel free to register your free account in there, and we'll make sure that you have access to this recording. And just wanted to say again, Dan, thank you so much. And Rose, do you have any closing words?
I just want to thank Dan so much for being with us today, and I hope people will follow, go to his blog, go to his website. Also, too, please be sure to complete the evaluation. We've dropped a couple of
Oh.
links in. And Dan, we'd love to have you out have you back sometime. This has been amazing. Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but amazing. Thank
A
you.
quick question for you. Is there a way I can answer the questions now and have them sent to the people who asked the questions?
Yes, I don't know about directly sent to the people, but what I can
Okay.
do is get the questions out of this Q&A and send them to you, and I'll make sure we post that in our Connect extension platform.
Perfect. Let's do that.
Okay. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everybody, for watching.